I think I want to first just thank Chris for making this film. Um, it's painful but essential history and watching. I've seen it a number of times at this point, and it's always a little shocking. I always learn a bit more, um, and as a native Wilmingtonian, it continues to deeply impact me, and I think my family as well. Um, so Chris, thank you. I think it's a gift. I think your movie is a gift to us all. Like I think the book Wilmington's Lie by David Zucchino is a gift. I think your movie is certainly a gift. And so, with that said, I just want to ask you the kind of basic question of what inspired you to do it.
Well, I guess what inspired me to do this was just, I guess, the love of our history, and also wanting to tell this story. No one actually did a feature length documentary on it, and I said, you know what, I'm gonna stop complaining about Hollywood and saying, why isn't Hollywood or why hasn't someone done a documentary on the 1898 Wilmington massacre? And I said, you know what, I'm gonna take the initiative and I'm gonna do it. And so I got some friends together, and we didn't really know what we were doing at the time because it was really it was our first film. Me, my camera guy, my composer, everyone who really worked on this project. It was really our first major feature film project. And but we all had one goal in mind, was to really tell the story and to get it out there as much as possible. And I think we accomplished that.
I think you did as well. So thank you very much. When did you first? I have to admit, like I grew up in Wilmington, and I never heard of this history until long after I had moved away. But when did you first hear about it?
I was a kid. I was around because my uncle, he used to live in Wilmington. And Laurinburg, where I'm originally from, born and raised, is about an hour and a half from Wilmington. And so my uncle, he would travel a lot, and wherever city or town he would go, he would always look up the history of that place. And he would always kind of talk about some of those things of what he was finding out about Wilmington's history. And so hearing that as a kid, kind of stood out to me. But it wasn't later on in life where I started to do my own research and seeing some things about it. And I said, okay, this is what my uncle was talking about when I was a kid. And so that made me want to just research some more. And then I think LeRae Umfleet, LeRae had just put out her book. And she had did the report, and then she put out her book, and I checked that out. I was like, man, this is crazy, because it really went in depth. And then that's when I connected with Larry Reni Thomas. And from there on, I said, man, I want to do a documentary on this. Can you help me out? And he said, yo, let's do it. And so he connected me with Dr. Manley, Miss Faith Chaplin, and other people, Professor Darity as well. And we put it together.
Well, thank you again for doing that. I want to definitely turn to Lorraine because she's extremely knowledgeable about all of this. Knows so many details that it kind of blew my mind. So Lorraine, I'm going to get to you, but I want to talk to Dr. Manley first because um, your grandfather's a hero to many, including me. And before I ask you this question, Dr. Manley, I want to just acknowledge something that Chris said in terms of I think a distinction that I don't want to overgeneralize, but I feel like I um, think it might be true. I feel like those of us who grew up in Wilmington proper were intentionally prevented from knowing this history. Not just us. I mean, I think other people in North Carolina as well. Um, but most of the people I talked to who actually were born and raised in Wilmington did not know about it. And so it's interesting to me that there are people like you who did hear bits and pieces of it, certainly not the full thing, when you were growing up, um, but not, someone who grew up in Wilmington. And I just wonder I'm not, this is not a question, but I just wonder if there's something there. It seemed to me like there was an intentional effort to keep people who actually grew up in Wilmington from knowing about that history for some reason. But Dr. Manley, I wanted to turn to you and just hear from you what you knew about it. You did not grow up in Wilmington, as the movie pointed out. Your grandfather fled, right, to save his life. Um, and so, could you tell us where you grew up and what you knew about this history that the movie talks about?
Okay, I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, which I told you earlier was the cultural center of the South, of course. And I knew very little about what happened in Wilmington. My father wrote a few times about it, but really he didn't know a lot about it. But I'm gonna give you a good example why people didn't talk about it. I'm gonna show you a picture of my great aunts. That's right here.
Yeah.
These are my great aunts who lived in Wilmington, and here they are in their 90s right here. This is my Aunt Felice down at the bottom right here, and Aunt Mabel. Well, when I visited with them, I tried to get them to talk about what happened in Wilmington in 1898. They would talk about everything that happened to the family, uh, the slavery part, everything. And then when I'd ask them about 1898, it would freeze up and time would just stop for them. I didn't really find out what happened until they did the report. And it seems that they were in school when the coup d'etat happened, and their brother had to get them and bring them home. So they walked through the streets as people were being shot down and machine gun, and they suffered with post-stress disorder for the rest of their lives. I mean, it was just unbelievable. They had a great respect for white people and a great fear for good reason, because they knew exactly how evil and what they could do. And they always discuss the good whites that took him because they stayed. The Sagewell, that was the maiden name of my grandmother, that family stayed in Wilmington, and they eventually gave the house to the Baha'i faith. They gave up Christianity to embrace that religion because I guess what they saw as religion and the preachers doing 1898 was not a religion they needed to follow. So the history of what happened there, I sometimes think of it as black history, but it's not black history. It's American history, pure and simple. And a lot of things that happen today is, as Faulkner said, the past is not dead. It's not even the past. So we are dealing with a situation where we had red shirts in Wilmington, and now we had red hats in the 21st century. The thinking is the very same thinking. So we are dealing with problems that seems like they won't go away unless we really do something about it. And there are people who are trying. So I commend Chris for doing this. He did a fantastic job with this documentary.
Well, thank you. I just agree with so much of what you said about this history not being just something in the past. It seems to be repeating itself. And also your point about how your aunt suffered PTSD from that experience, and it seems to me that experience of being traumatized by what happened, and also the fear, right, of the potential for something like that, maybe on a smaller scale, to happen again. Those are things that kept people from talking about. And but I want to explore some more of the history. I'm going to turn to the historian, LeRae, and I was just really deeply impressed by the detail of what you had to share in the movie. And we're talking about, in part, the parallels of what happened then and kind of what happened now. But one of the things I wanted to start with is what are your thoughts on the fact, I think, that so little of this history was actually taught in school or otherwise? What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks for having me. It's been great watching the movie again. So I think us not knowing about the history of what happened in 1898 through its omission in published history books in North Carolina and the United States is by design. Almost immediately, people like Alfred Moore Wydell and the other leadership in the white Democratic Party created a narrative that said, a horrible thing happened, we did what we had to do, let's move on. And so they did. And the history and the truths of what happened in 1898 were buried in the history books and in the memory of Wilmingtonians and North Carolinians. Even in the white community, descendants of some of the folks who were the perpetrators didn't know that their ancestors had done what they had done until I started releasing the findings from my report and doing speaker sessions in Wilmington on the book. So yeah, it's been buried for a very, very long time. And it's a tragic thing that we all should be understanding in multifaceted ways. It's not just murder in the streets. It's not just the political coup. It's not just the economic disadvantages that came to the African-American community. It's all of that combined. And so things like what you're doing tonight, Chris's movie, David Zucchino's book that grows from the work that I did, all of these things together build a critical mass of getting the story and the information out across the country.
Well, thank you for your book spawning so much of the conversation that has happened recently, especially. I'm really grateful to you. I have to say, when we talk about parallels and how what's old is new and how history is, again, not ancient, but present as well, it reminds me of the current effort, right, to ban critical race theory from being taught. Not that it ever was, right, to my knowledge, right, but it seems like there's an intentional effort to prevent American history, not just Black history, as Dr. Manley pointed out, but the truth, right, about what happened from being told. And I'm wondering what you all think, right, about the fact that for those of us like here tonight, we are interested in knowing the truth. We want to know, what really happened. But on the other hand, there are many people who don't want to know, right? And their, state legislatures are doing what they can to prevent people from finding out. And also to your point, LeRae, the winners control the narrative. They write the narrative, and then that's what we are taught, in fact, and that's what we have to deal with. But any thoughts from any of you on this effort to keep Americans from really knowing the truth about these things happening in our country, and especially when it comes to incidents that really, really harmed African Americans? Dr. Manley, I think you're muted.
In January in the U.S. Capitol, something happened there, and as we speak, we don't know what happened. How did it happen? It's being pushed under the rug so fast that it doesn't even exist. So it's just repeating itself 100%.
Yeah, that's so true. Anyone else want to comment on that? Because I have certainly some other questions.
Well, for teachers in the classroom, this is a tough subject for some to teach for a variety of reasons. And I've been working in my capacity as a historian to help teachers understand the history so that if they can understand the facts of what happened, that may be able to help them more accurately teach this history in the classroom. So just the facts man, from my perspective, helps teach the history in a very vibrant way when we understand what Wilmington was like, what happened in Wilmington, and the ramifications for not just Wilmington, but North Carolina, and in fact, the rest of the nation. So, helping teachers understand these truths is something that I've been trying to do.
Well, I appreciate you're doing that. And I think that's right. Just the facts. Like, the facts doesn't mean that people have an agenda one way or the other. But I think there's something powerful in just knowing what happened. And I think it's a disservice to all of us when we try to keep those facts from people, and they can have devastating consequences. And again, history repeating itself. I think each of you talked a little bit, and obviously I grew up in Wilmington and I still have relatives there, and I visit a lot. I live in Philadelphia now. But I think each of you talked in the documentary about the impact and the legacy of the massacre on Wilmington presently, including how many people fled and never returned, about limited economic prosperity, about the Black population going from majority to 18 or so percent, I think now, if that much, and also about the reputation of Wilmington as hostile to African Americans. I'm just wondering what the legacy has been on Wilmington since 1898, and I just throw that open to any of you.
Go for it, Chris. You've been working with some folks in town. So what have you been seeing? You're on the streets right now.
Yeah, I was filming last week here. We've been filming Wilmington on Fire Chapter 2. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do a Chapter 2, to really show that lasting legacy of the 1898 massacre in Wilmington. But to me, of documenting these several individuals in Wilmington now and the great work they're doing, is that I think there's hope. I know with the first film, was just straight about history and the massacre. And I said, there's more to it, because I was coming to Wilmington all the time. I met my wife here because I was coming to Wilmington to film all the time. And so I just got drenched in the community and started seeing some wonderful things happening. And I think the film really opened the eyes to a lot of people as well throughout the city and changed a lot of things in the city as well. And I just wanted to document that. But I think, the lasting the legacy of Wilmington, I think, is this whole thing of white supremacy. But I think it's going to take the community in Wilmington to change that. And that's what I've been trying to do with this second chapter of Wilmington on Fire, to show the community in Wilmington that are saying enough is enough. We have to change this history of what Wilmington is, because anytime stuff happens in Wilmington, and we've seen it, we saw it last year with the murder of George Floyd, and then we saw it with the Wilmington Police Department, where the 3 officers, were recorded talking about killing Black people at will in Wilmington. So even with January 6th, found out that a group of folks from Wilmington went up there to participate in the January 6th attempted coup. And so that's what I'm saying. It's like this whole thing of the community finally saying, you know what, we have to change this legacy of white supremacy in Wilmington. And I think you're starting to see that change in Wilmington now. Well, it's going to take a while. It's going to take a while to get there.
Yeah, I'm really happy to hear you use the word hope, right? Because I think hope is a practice, right? And I think we have to really aspire to have it in order to really have some important change. And I'm happy to hear you kind of beat me to the punch. I was going to talk about Wilmington on Fire too a little bit later toward the end of our conversation, but I'm happy to have you already discuss the fact that you're working on it now. LeRae, did you want to add anything about the impact?
I'm a preservationist. And for me, I'm not from Wilmington. I don't live in Wilmington, but I go to Wilmington a lot. My car could drive there by itself. But when I go to Wilmington and I go to that hallowed ground where people died and suffered, I have seen in the last nearly 20 years a change in that space where traditional African-American communities with homes traditionally owned by Black people have been transitioning into new white communities with people who are moving into those communities, raising the tax base and living in these historic houses. And the built history that is reflective of 1898 is being dissolved. And if you go into the history of white Wilmington, you've got the Bellamy Mansion, you've got big monuments that are still in town. But if you want to see monuments to the Black community, those are disappearing or they have already disappeared. Now we have the really wonderful monument for 1898, but that event and the ramifications of that event are found throughout the city. And I hope that we can find a way to do something to preserve these traditional Black communities, to keep Black families in what was their family's heritage in that area. So, I mean, for me, the preservation is, I'd like to see some work done to help keep that going.
Yeah, I have been very impressed to Chris's point about people there now doing great work. I've been very impressed with the activism that is happening there. For sure.
I know that there's a group that is really working with a set of genealogists, and they are taking people list by list, by name, and they're trying to find people at the granular level who are descendants of that trauma, not just the violence, not just the economic impact, but the whole drama and trauma that happened in that city on November 10th and around the 10th.
Yeah, I've heard about that. That's really powerful.
Yeah.
Dr. Manley, speaking of the legacy of the massacre in Wilmington, I mean, your family was directly impacted, and I'm just wondering, just my own. I'm a lawyer, and just my own lawyerly curiosity is what connection, if any, that you have and your family continues to have, if any, with Wilmington today. Do you go back? Do you have relatives there still? I mean, can you share a little bit on that?
Well, as I said earlier, that I had these great aunts who actually were victims of the coup d'etat. So I visited with them, but they've been dead for quite some time, and they deeded their house over to their religion. I don't know whether they still have it, but they lived there, and that's another story, is how they were protected. Because if I go into the story of the Saginaw family, it's a very unusual family. It's another lady writing a book about it as we speak, as to one of their white ancestors who was given to the slaves to raise as a black person. One of the daughters had an affair with a sea captain, and this child was given over to the slaves to raise. So he's sort of like the ugly duckling out there in a slave. I guess he looked up one day and said, "Wait a minute, I don't look like anybody here." And it was sort of changed. But I look at Wilmington as the actually the start of everything that happened with systemic racism in the 20th century. Because what happened there, the next place was Atlanta in 1906. The same type of thing happened, not exactly the same, but almost the same. And it left there and went to Tulsa, and of course Tulsa is getting a whole lot of play. But it shows that white people dislike us to the point that it's not going to be a middle class, whether you didn't want any part of us, or if you're living among us, you got to go as a middle class. You can only stay as a worker. And I think one of the stars of this documentary is Kent Chatfield. I don't know how you got him to tell a story he told, but he is really one heck of a story in there as to what happened to the property that these people had, and all this stuff seemed to just disappear in the thin air. They didn't put them on a train to banish them and say, "Okay, here's, I understand this is your property, here's the money to take it and go." Because in my family, my grandfather had his tax bill, and he sent it back to Wilmington, paid by Almond Scott, who became a judge. But when he got to the tax bill, and apparently the red shirts were waiting for Manley, and he burned up the property papers and whatever, and so whatever he accumulated dissipated into thin air. So it's a story that starts there, but the government is very complicit, and it's not just North Carolina, it's the whole country. The whole country is basically see us as the Constitution did as 3/5 of a human being. We're not real people. And that's very active to this very day.
Thank you for sharing that. You know, your point about how what happened in 1898 kind of becoming the blueprint for white supremacy in other parts, in other places in the country. I talk about Wilmington being the port city. And I talk about one of the things that it exported was white supremacy, and became the blueprint for how these campaigns can be successful throughout the country. I think you're still muted. We can't hear you.
But it didn't matter. In Tulsa, it was an all-black operation. It didn't matter whether you were working with whites or whoever. You had to go. It was just too close to the activity, and you just couldn't do the things you were doing. But Wilmington certainly was the start of all this. And in my family lore is that Ellis Manley got to D.C. and Congressman George White got him an interview with McKinley in the White House.
Yeah.
And when McKinley realized that it was the Ellis Manley, he was boot kicked right out. He's the only Manley to get to go to the White House, and out he went. So he had no interest in, because letters were coming out of Wilmington. People were writing, saying, "Come help us." So actually, one woman said, "Send us back to Africa. If you hate us as much, let us go. We don't need to be here." But you had to be there for the cotton compress, because that was the biggest operation in Wilmington. And I think of, they said, well, no white man can work in the cotton compress to pick up these heavy loads of cotton. And I think of Richard Pryor when he said two of them worked at the foundry lifting motors. Well, they probably did lift cotton bales. They were that strong. So this is a very important story. There's no end to it.
Yeah, I think there are many more stories to be told. And so, LeRae, I wanna ask you a question or two. First of all, could you tell us the name of your book?
So I just have my examples here. The report came out in 2006, excuse me, and it was a 500-page legislative report, and there was a secondary storyline and all the footnotes. So in 2009, we turned it into a book, The Day of Blood. And The Day of Blood, it's available online. You can get it at Amazon. UNC Press has it out there. We just went into a reprint. We'd sold out the first couple of runs, and so we went into a reprint in 2020. So have at it, go find it. We priced it very affordably because we want it out there for people to read and reference and learn from. And what was the question?
No, the question I haven't asked you yet. Just the name of your book. So you answered that correctly. My second question was going to be, Dr. Manley talked about how similar incidents happened in Tulsa and Charleston and Atlanta and other places. But I want to talk about what's distinct about what happened in Wilmington. So I'm gonna let you answer that. I have some thoughts, but I want to hear you answer.
So there had been violence against Blacks repeatedly throughout the South following the Civil War. What happened in Wilmington was the result of a well-planned political campaign, and it was about the white supremacy party getting itself together to regain control that they had lost of not only Wilmington, but North Carolina as a whole. And it was a long range plan. It wasn't just a quick one and done. It was, let's regain control in 1898 of the state legislature. And then in 1900, after we've rewritten laws and gerrymandered districts and reduced voter, about ability to vote, we will then regain control of the governor's office. So it was a multi-tiered, multifaceted approach in Wilmington that was highly orchestrated, not only in New Hanover County, but across North Carolina. And this is one of the first times we see such a well-planned attack to achieve a political goal, which is white supremacy and subjugation of Black voters and economic interests. And so I think that's one of the unique hallmarks of what happened in 1898. And of course, we have all of these results from that, the coup, the murder, all of those other bits. But it's a long range, well-planned, focused attack.
Yeah, exactly. That's precisely the answer I was hoping for, where some of these other situations and incidents kind of sprung up, right? Like a Black guy was accused of looking at a white woman or something, or saying something to her. It kind of sprung up somewhat organically. This thing was planned, like for many, many months, and out in the open. Like, as the documentary covers, the Raleigh News and Observer was very kind of open with what it was seeking to do. It wasn't secret, right?
Right. So I saw somebody asked about the name of my book. It's called A Day of Blood, the 1898 Wilmington Race Riot. And A Day of Blood is the headline title from the News and Observer for the day after the violence in Wilmington. These people who were planning this attack were very, very coordinated. They used every bit of airtime, so to speak. They didn't have airtime in 1898. They had newspapers and speech makers, but they used every available resource to get their message out. And they were very, very proud of what they were doing, and they did not hide it. They did it in broad daylight. They didn't cover their faces with hoods. They wanted you to know who they were. And even after the violence was over, after they had won their goal of controlling city of Wilmington, county New Hanover, state of North Carolina, they continuously kept that narrative going and putting their names out there, bragging and proud of what they did. In fact, the members of the Wilmington Light Infantry had annual oyster roasts on November 10th in subsequent years to celebrate their victory. So they were very, very proud of what they did.
Yeah. So this is to Chris and to anybody who wants to answer this question, what to call what happened, like, right? Some people said it was a riot, other people a coup or massacre. What's the appropriate way to describe what really happened?
I guess I'll go. I'll go first. I guess to me, I think it's all the above. I always call it a massacre and a coup. I think it's both, and I think we have to look at it as both as well, because it was a coup and it was a massacre as well, and also just an American tragedy. You know what I'm saying? Because these were American citizens that were killed, and I always try to emphasize that, as well. So to me, it was a coup and a massacre and an American tragedy.
This happened right after the Spanish-American War. There were Black soldiers down in Florida from North Carolina, and they were kept down there. The white soldiers from Wilmington were brought back to Wilmington with those two Gatling guns or whatever. But the Black soldiers who could have perhaps been very helpful in keeping the massacre under control were kept down there the whole time. So it's the complicity of the government, the U.S. and the state government to let something like that happen. It didn't just happen out of the clear blue sky. It was well planned.
So I use Race Riot on my title of my book, and that goes back to the way the event was referred to in 1998 at the centennial. And it was called a race riot. I mean, there were also massacre and coup and other words like that. But the General Assembly created the Wilmington Race Riot Commission. And the work that I did with the report and then the book was an outflow from the commission. So we were sort of tied to that terminology. When we reprinted the book last year, I tried to change the title because our concept of what a race riot was in 1900 is mostly accurate for what happened. But then you get the 20th century and Rodney King, and moving forward in time, the concept of what a race riot has changed. And it is a massacre. It is a coup. It's a tragedy, murder, every other horrible kind of descriptor you could use is what happened in Wilmington. And so there, yeah, it's all of the above.
Well, thank you. And thank you about that history about for what you did to try to change the terminology riots too, because it just, to me, riots doesn't really seem to capture what it was. Riot seems like it was two-sided to me, right? And it doesn't, and I just don't think it was.
Yeah.
I think it was a massacre.
Well, yeah, there was no retaliation from the Black community. And the official definition of race riot up until the mid 20th century was invasion of a Black neighborhood by white armed men. So it was appropriate at the time. However, modern thought processes have and modern history has changed what we consider to be a race riot. And so, yeah, I rarely use the word riot anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me either. Dr. Manley did make reference to the events of January 6th. And I just want to open it up to any of you to talk about what parallels you see, if any, to that event and what happened in 1898.
I know I got a lot of requests for interviews on November 7th.
January 7th.
Yeah, January 7th, excuse me. Because even late night hosts on January 6th had referenced, even I think in an MSNBC newscaster referenced 1898 when watching the activity in the Capitol live on January 6th. So my problem, and it's not a problem, it's just that I'm a historian. I've been studying 1898 for nearly 20 years. There are things we still don't know about what happened on November 10th, 1898. We're 6 or 7 months removed from the violence at the Capitol, and we are still trying to figure out the who's its and the what's its of that god awful event. A lot of us, we can probably figure out a lot of it, but we still don't know the machinations behind the scenes. And so to compare Wilmington to January 6th, for me as a historian, my historian brain wants to wait until the facts are out to make those comparisons. But to look at what happened in Wilmington, you have a well-armed mob of red shirts who were given lots and lots of propaganda from newspapers and speech makers, and who were provided weapons from the Democratic Party. There's distribution of weapons in the city by the rallies that the Democratic Party had. And the intensity of the propaganda campaign that was swirling around Wilmington between August and November of 1898 created this critical mass of people in the white community who were in a frenzy and who were afraid and who felt like they had empowerment from their leadership to do what happened on November 10th. And I believe that some of the white leadership in Wilmington did not believe that their threat of violence would turn into real violence. And I put that in my book several places, that the threat of violence was what I think a lot of people thought that was all was needed. But it overflowed into real violence in Wilmington. And with the burning of Alex Manly's printing press, there's this sociological thing that happens with a mob, and people forget who they are and they lose their moral compass, and things got out of hand. That's not to give anyone an absolute, they're not absolving anyone in my point of view on this, but it got out of hand really fast in Wilmington on November 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th.
Chris, I think you said that what you've discovered is that some Wilmingtonians participated in the events of January 6th?
I don't know if they actually participated, but we do know that members of the Republican Party of Wilmington, New Hanover County, went up there around that time. I don't know for sure they was actually in the mix, but we do know they actually went up there. And I know a lot of folks thought that, okay, are they going to bring that mentality back to Wilmington? We interviewed a young guy the other day. He was part of the protest movements that was going on last year in Wilmington. And he talked about that when we sat down to interview him, finding out that a lot of them went up there. They took a bus up there. They don't really know if they actually participated, but they know they went. But their whole thing was, are they going to bring that same mentality back to Wilmington? And can they recreate that type of climate of 1898 again? That's what they were worried about. So that's why, I think it has that similar, to me, it was some similarities to it because of what the citizens of Wilmington were thinking about once they saw some folks go to DC around that time and thinking like, okay, they're going to be hyped up. They're going to come back down to Wilmington, and it might be something similar to what they try to do as well.
Yeah, I have to say, I definitely thought about it right away. And I thought about some of the parallels being the outcome of an election that some people didn't like or wanted to influence, right? The election of 1898 in November was a very kind of centralizing thing that got people all galvanized and revved up. I thought about the kind of heightened presence of the military and the police, either past military folks or past police officers. Like there was a heavy presence of them on January 6th, just that they played a major role in what happened in 1898. And also just fear of losing power, right? I think that seemed to me to be very much a parallel between then and now. So yeah, very, very interesting stuff. So but I wanted to go back to a couple things that were mentioned in the film, and one of the comments that I think somebody said was that this is about money and power and not race, talking about the events of 1898. And I just wondered if you all agreed with that statement. I want to start with you, Dr. Manly. Do you agree that what happened in 1898 was about money and power and not race?
For the above, it was everything, because race was money. This is just 30-something years after the Civil War, and the power and money in the South was black bodies. The richest people in the South live over in Mississippi. Well, not in the South, but in this country. Those cotton brokers and growers over there. So it's all of the above.
Does Chris or LeRae, do you have any thoughts on that?
I totally agree with him. You know what I'm saying? I think it's he hit it right on the money. To me, it's race, power, money, all the above.
LeRae.
I agree. The white supremacy campaign was the platform of white supremacy. The Democratic Party had tried to use it every year since the end of Reconstruction, unsuccessfully. This was the first time they were able to get it to take traction and make hold. And it was to regain political power. And when you have political power, you therefore control economic diversity and wealth. And so it's all of the above.
Great. Thank you. So I want to talk about a comment Dr. Manley made in the film, but more broadly about something that Larry talked about too. Larry Reni Thomas talked about, which is about reparations and compensation to the victims of 1898 and the importance of that and what that might look like. And I'm just wondering, Dr. Manley, you made a comment about, I think you were joking when you talked about cars and Cadillacs and all of that, but a couple of people responded to that comment, and you weren't joking. Okay. But I want to know, I do want to hear from each of you what you think justice looks like. Does it include compensation and reparations? Yeah, so if you all could respond to that, I'd appreciate it.
But I feel the same way now as I did in the film, that first things should revolve around education. That anybody who is a direct descendant should get free education in any school in the country. And one other thing, perhaps, relief from any taxation. Just eliminate taxes. Because if we think about a monetary reparation, that's not going to work. It would break the country. The interest on it would break the country. But it wouldn't be any money in the treasury of this country. The cost is that great. So it has to be something practical that people can, if you're educated, you can build on that. That is wealth. You know, it's not what on top of your head, but what's in it. I look at a lot of people during the pandemic, the barbers have really suffered because of the hairstyles I see now. So many Medusa heads, but for the most part.
Well, let me just say, let me say, I really appreciate your point about it not just being about money, right? I think a lot of people, when they get caught up in the logistics of how it might work, right? And so they therefore won't even allow for the conversation about reparations to happen because they're like, it can't work because X, Y, Z. And I think we need to move beyond the concept. I think we need to move beyond the concept of equating reparations to just money. Because if you get, I think you get lost, you get stuck there, and then the conversation can't continue. But LeRae or Chris, do you have any thoughts on what justice might look like and reparations and compensation and any of that?
I think Dr. Manley trying to speak. If you go mute him.
I was about to say the economists in the documentary said that if it was just money, it wouldn't stay in the black community. It only makes one trip through the black community, it'd be gone the next day. So it has to be education.
Well, I think I'm not an economist or anything, but I've talked to Dr. Sandy Darity, who was featured in the film. He worked on the economic impact of the report, and him and his wife, I always suggest their book. They have an excellent book called From Here to Equality, and he actually kind of came up with a plan for reparations, for African Americans, and they use the events of Wilmington, Tulsa, Jim Crow segregation, slavery, all these things that have impacted African Americans in this country economically and everything into this book. And they kind of have like a plan, really, to me, one of the only plans we've ever had of trying to get some type of plan of reparations for our people. And so I always tell people to read his book. And because I just think that I don't know, you know what I'm saying? Because I mean, I'm a business owner. I would love to get some type of, tax breaks or no taxes, so I can build up my business so I can make more films like Wilmington on Fire. So, that's what I want. And, maybe, something in regards to getting a house as well. But I know, years ago when LeRae did a report and, they tried to create a series of legislation bills that never got passed, they wanted to kind of do some of these reparations initiatives. One was like to actually compensate folks like Dr. Manley and others who had direct losses because of 1898. They talked about creating like a couple of black business district incubators in Wilmington on the north side, the 4th Street North Side area, Castle Street, also to pay a production company $500,000 to do what I did. So it was a whole bunch of things, but none of the stuff got passed. You know what I'm saying? So there were cool initiatives, but they just never got passed. So, it's just gonna take us just to keep pushing, but what it looks like, I don't know. And so I always suggest people to check out Professor Darity's book, From Here to Equality. And I guess we can just go from there.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading that. LeRae, thank you. I'm looking forward to reading that. LeRae, were you gonna ask anything else?
The Wilmington Race Riot Commission was created by the legislature. And after reading my report, they created a series of recommendations that were presented to the legislature. Some were put into committee for consideration and they never made it out of the committees. There were 15 individual suggestions for things to do, everything from economic empowerment to education to commemoration and back again. And as Chris and everyone else has said, nothing happened with those. Again, politics. But so I think it is something that if there's a will, there's a way, and we should continue to try to find a way to acknowledge the loss of the entrepreneurial spirit in Wilmington. Those business owners, they did lose economic opportunities. African Americans were fired from Black people were fired from businesses and government offices across the board, and whites hired in their places. How do you put a dollar sign to that? That's something Sandy Darity would have to help us with. But it's documented the losses. How to deal with those losses is something that I'll just write you the history and demonstrate the truth, and then I'll let people like Sandy figure it out.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you, and I think you said it best when you said, "But there's a will, there's a way." Reparations have been paid. Monetary reparations have been paid by this country to others in the past. So if the country had a strong desire to do it, I think there are many, many smart people who could figure out how to make it work. But I just want to be mindful of time. I want to thank you all for your time, and I want to just close really with any final thoughts you have. And maybe we can do that in reaction to another comment that someone made in the film, and so you can tell me whether or not you agree with it. But he said Wilmington is going to rise back up, and so let's have each of you respond to that, and as we bring the evening to a close. You agree with that?
I agree. I think it is economically in a better position than it was when I started working on this stuff nearly 20 years ago. As a whole, it's now a tourist destination. Downtown has been revived, and even more than it was then. There are businesses up and down the streets and people are working, but is it an equitable distribution of this revival? Is it equitable for everyone in the city? That is something that someone like Chris, who is in the city more often than I am, could say too. But just traveling through some of those communities, I don't believe it's equitable. That's just, me being a passenger driving through some of these towns and things like that. But I still think there's a lot of work to be done to get this history preserved, interpreted, shared, and better understood. So I think there's hope, just like Chris said. There is hope, and we'll keep working at it.
Great. Chris, what do you think? Is Wilmington going to rise back up?
I think it is, and I think it can. And like I said, I'm filming Wilmington on Fire Chapter 2 right now. The city is still struggling, like what LeRae has just said, with that whole equity piece. But, they are trying. There's certain businesses. I know one, for example, one guy, he actually co-founded, and you probably know him as well, Joe Finley, co-founded Tech Mountain in Castle Branch. He's one business owner for sure that he reached out to me a few years ago watched Wilmington on Fire. He said, man, your film really changed my life, and it's making me want to do something different. And so, you know, he started doing more initiatives to get the white business community more involved in making Wilmington more equitable for its African-American citizens. And also, and like I said, we've been documenting him and the work he's been doing. And also, he was one of the first investors of a new co-working space downtown, which is Black owned, called Genesis Block. And he was one of those first investors of that to get that going, to help revitalize this Black entrepreneurial spirit, you know, in Wilmington. So those are some of the things that are happening, you know, on the low that a lot of people don't know about. And that's why I felt like it was important to highlight that, to show that, you know, Wilmington is trying to rise up, and there is like a small fusionist movement that's happening, you know, below the scenes, below the radar. And that's why it gives me hope. And, you know, I'll be actually moving to Wilmington probably in January or February. Like I said, because my wife lives here. And so I live in Durham. And so I know she was like, hey, you need to move to town. So
Well,
I'm happy to really be a part of this community even more. Cause like I said, I've been coming here nonstop since like 2011. And so like I said, this is like a second home to me, man. And I just want to contribute to it as much as possible.
well, thank you. Before we turn to Dr. Manley to get his perspective on whether Wilmington will rise back up, can you tell us when we can expect Wilmington on Fire Part 2?
Probably next year. I would say probably around fall of next year. We got a couple more things to knock out, but we should have a lot of those things knocked out by September. And then, you know, that post-production process goes, you know, about 8 to 9 months. So yeah, I would say around next fall, but definitely we'll keep y'all posted.
Thank you. Dr. Manley, the final word to you. Is Wilmington going to rise back up?
I haven't visited Wilmington in quite some time, so I will basically have to wait and see Chris's new documentary to pass some sort of judgment. So,
Okay. That's fair. Just the facts, right? Just the facts. I'm good with that. Listen, thank you all so very much for spending your time with us. Thank you, Chris, for the movie, LeRae for the amazing work you did in the book, Dr. Manley for keeping us on track with what we need to know, and everybody for tuning in. Really grateful to you all for supporting Free Speech TV, and I look forward to continued conversations about this very important issue.